Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of canon in fiction, and specifically how there really isn't any. So for those who don't know, by the way, the idea of a canon is within a collection of fictional works. There are, in later things, stuff that was established in earlier works that is regarded as true, treated as part of what has actually happened within the fictional continuity. This gets especially important whenever you have things, when you have multiple books, when you have multiple series, when you have multiple movies, things like that. There becomes the idea that fans can talk about of canon, like, did this really happen as part of it? It was especially important, I think perhaps one of the best examples is within the Star Wars expanded universe, where some books might count as canon, as in future movies would respect what happened in them, and other books wouldn't count as canon in that, future movies, future books, and so on were free to disregard what was in them. Now, and this idea, has broadened. For example, you might have, say, even within Star Wars, that the Star Wars Christmas special, holiday special, was not canon because future movies were not bound to respect anything that happened within it. Now, the thing I'm going to describe here is basically that's not actually a thing. This was motivated, by the way, with my conversation with Russell Newquist. We talked about this a little bit, and somewhat about the origins of it and how it doesn't really apply that much. But I want to talk about this on its own because it's a somewhat interesting subject, I think. This may sometimes be more a matter of nerd culture. It mostly is, but there are different subsets of nerd culture. I'm most familiar with it within, like, comic books and science fiction. I think it also applies in a variety of other places, though. And so the idea of canon is, in some sense, from a reader's perspective, from a viewer's perspective, it's a nice idea. The idea that having seen these movies, if you remember them, this won't conflict with what happens later. Plot holes aside. Now, the thing is, it doesn't work. People don't actually do it. The prequels throughout some... Star Wars, I'm sorry. The prequels throughout some of the stuff that was in the originals. The sequels throughout, from what I understand, pretty much everything. And especially they threw out the Star Wars expanded universe. So all the stuff that was supposed to be reliably actually part of the Star Wars universe, as I understand it from people who saw the movies, they just threw that all out. So for one thing, it doesn't work. There's actually an interesting point here about how that's one of the problems, that human canons don't work. The only way for a thing to truly remain canon is if there is some sort of actual, divine force behind it. But that's a side note because it's a complex argument and it's not correct in the simplistic form that I stated. Anyway, the food for thought to think about a real version. So the thing about fictional canon is that it's largely not even accomplishable because it takes if you're not the original author of a work, it takes an enormous amount of effort to put yourself in the mindset of a different person who lived a different life and wrote different sort of books than you would normally write. Some people occasionally achieve it. Every now and then, you'll get a book which is a sequel to some other book where the author just nailed it, like really nailed it perfectly, to the point where if you didn't see that it was written by somebody else, you might have actually thought it was written by the original author. That's a very rare accomplishment. That takes a lot of skill and a lot of devotion, and frankly, some underlying similarities of personality anyway. That's very, very rare, and by and large, it simply doesn't happen. The other thing is, even within one author, people change over time. Authors change over time. An author, if an author's writing, a series of books, who they are 10 years later is not the same. It's closely related, but it's not the same person they were 10 years before. And so even there, you won't get the same sort of consistency. That you'll get consistency, but not the sort of consistency that's really implied in the concept of canon. You may still get the author respecting what they did, but even there, the author may simply forget, the author may change their mind, and in some cases the author just feels very free, feeling like they own the thing to simply change stuff anyway, and get a little annoyed at people who remember their original works. You see a lot of different things that happen. The end result of which is that there really isn't a form of canon. What we actually have is something that's much, much closer to the ancient Greek city-states and the sort of myths that they had in the ancient Greek city-states. Because it was not the case, and this is something that took me a while to find out, it is not the case that there was, like a book of Greek myths that all the Greeks throughout Greece knew. It was almost the way it was presented to me when I was young, like in school, as we were learning the history of this. It was presented like, here are the myths. No, that's really not how it was. Depending on which city-state you were, there were the particular myths that they had. Some of the things we think of as myths are even just, poems and plays and stuff like that, where that was like their version of comic books. But you'd go to, Athens and you get some stories. You go to Sparta and you get other stories. You go to Corinth and you get other stories. So you go to Syracuse and you get different stories. Some of them you'd find in multiple places. Some of them would be fairly common. But there was no sort of uniformity of the thing. It gets even worse, actually, because, languages were fairly distinct at the time. There's Greece where everyone spoke Greek, and then there were the barbarians who didn't speak Greek. Who sounded to the Greeks like they were saying bar, 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 so they called them the barbarians. Anyway, was it Barbaros, I think? Something like that. Anyway, but it's really fascinating. If you read Herodotus's history, and he goes to different places, and talks to people there, what's interesting is that one of his concerns is the local religions. And so, he'll talk to people in one place, and then the way he reports it is, well, here they call Zeus this, and they call Hera that, and they don't really worship Hephaestus at all, but they call Mercury this. And, for example, he traces the story of Hercules in the Latin. And his theory is that there were actually two different cults of Heracles, or two different cults originally, one of a god and one of a hero, that eventually got intertwined because you could find places where the stories that were told of Heracles in Greece were either all just the one more divine type of story in certain places, and they didn't talk about any of the hero stuff at all, and in other places where they only talked about the hero stuff and not at all about the divine stuff. And so it was actually his theory that these two cults sort of merged when they came to Greece, and that's how you get Heracles, the demigod, where you have both the stories of the hero and stories of the divine figure. Remembering divine in ancient Greece is a lot less divine. Just means really much significantly more than human, but not divine in the Christian sense. So you have that as what ancient Greece looked like. Depending on where you go, people have very different ideas. Some with overlap, some not, some with some superficial characteristics, some extremely different. And that's really what we have with modern fiction, especially modern fiction if there's any sort of company behind it. So, to take an example, I collected comic books roughly from the late 80s into the mid to late 1990s. And so that's most of my experience. I've looked at comic books a little bit since, and they're not that interesting these days. But not the inherent form, just what's actually available. And I'm sure that there are exceptions, but especially checking out some of the things that I liked as a kid, because I was primarily into Spider-Man, The Flash, Green Lantern somewhat, Hulk somewhat, and Spider-Man's a really good example to go with, because if you look at the Spider-Man when I was collecting, and I remember issue number 1 of Spider-Man coming out, it was around, I think, issue 300 something of the Amazing Spider-Man, and issue 140, somewhere in that range, of the Spectacular Spider-Man. So those were 3 different. They were sort of kind of a little bit in continuity with each other. Spider-Man less so than the other two, and they were different takes on it, told somewhat different sorts of stories. They had at least some continuity, a little bit of continuity, not very much in common with each other. So right there, there's at least some, like, they agree on whether or not Peter Parker was married to Mary Jane Watson. But, at least that's my memory of it. But, having said that, right there you have three somewhat different stories. But the thing is, they did tend to be in continuity, at least with themselves, for a fairly long time. So, I mean, reading for a number of years, things that happened, Peter Parker would remember. They didn't bring it up very often, but he would. They things that changed would actually, like, affect things, and so on. You bring that into the modern world, though, and the thing is, well, if you're talking about Spider-Man at all, well, there's the Spider-Man of the comics, and you kind of, sort of need to specify which comic, somewhat. Certainly for a given storyline, there'd be different times, and he'd fight different people, so you'd kind of have to specify which time, but, that happens. But it gets really bad when you look forward, because then there are the cartoon Spider-Mans. And there are actually a bunch of different cartoon Spider-Mans by a bunch of different people who wrote Spider-Man as a fairly different character. I mean, still the very basics. His name was Peter Parker. He could stick to walls. He could shoot webs. How strong he is would vary wildly throughout, both the comics and especially the various cartoons. But just sort of like, he had certain elements of whininess, certain elements of heroism, etc. It would vary a lot with the different cartoons that you would watch. Then throw in the movies, and yet again, the character is very different. The continuity changes significantly. Oh yeah, they threw in what is it, the Unlimited series or something like that? In the comics in, I don't know, around the 2000s, something like that, where they did new backstories for everybody. So again, they threw out the continuity. So the thing is, at this point, if you want to talk about Spider-Man, it's a lot like talking about Heracles. Which one? In the same way you'd say, like, well, which city are you going to? Because you'll get very different stories in different places. Well, which Spider-Man do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about the one from that one cartoon that ran several years? Do you want to talk about that one from that cartoon that only lasted 1 year, but was fairly good? Do you want to talk about that other one that only lasted 1 year? Oh, and the video games. I'm sorry, I forgot about the video games. Again, you get a fair amount of storytelling in the video games, which is kind of vaguely, loosely based on the movies, sort of. At least one of them I remember, the one with Dr. Octopus, which is either a PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 2 game, I'm pretty sure. You could tell that the writers were at least as influenced by the comic books as by the movies, probably much more so. They threw in a bunch of characters who weren't in the movie, and they're much better characters. It was a movie tie-in, as a money grab, but it was actually, like, they did the storytelling pretty well. And the point of bringing in this again, it's so much you can barely keep track of it, is that you can't keep track of it. That's my point. That there's no point in keeping track of it. There's no actual continuity. And this brings me, by the way, to something that comes up when we look at Star Wars, and in particular, people talking about the Last Jedi, but even The Force Awakens. And it's something I mentioned to Russell when I was talking to him, that I sort of essentially took one look and decided, no, this is not going to be for me. I'm not going to watch this, because I know I'm going to hate it. And, there will be people who like it. I mean, $200 million buys you a lot of spectacle, and spectacle is widely enjoyable. There'll be lots of people who don't particularly know the originals or have a deep connection to the originals, for whom the overthrow of the originals is not going to be much of a problem. Because, just look at it. What are the odds they're actually going to pay decent respect to the originals? Approximately 0. What did they do? Not respect the originals. Hey, I'm shocked. But here's the thing. Okay. It's unfortunate somebody made a movie that I wouldn't like, because it'd be great if every movie was made in such a way that I would like it. But having said that, so what? They don't retroactively change the originals. I know George Lucas actually did, but you can still buy the originals too. And mostly his changes weren't that bad, by the way. It was unfortunate in some cases. Some cases it was fairly reasonable. The addition of more TIE fighters in some scenes, where it was kind of odd that they put in so few TIE fighters. Fine. That ridiculous thing where Guido shot first is I'm sorry, where Greedo shot first is weird because it utterly morally changes the scene. Incidentally, because if you think about it for just a second, originally there's the guy who is a clear and present threat who has announced his intention to kill Han Solo, and so given that the guy has presently announced his intention, which is very credible because he's got a deadly weapon pointed at Han Solo to immediately kill Han Solo then ends the threat in front of him. This is all very reasonable. If a person believably, plausibly tells you that he's about to murder you, killing him, stopping him in general, but if your only option there is killing him, is self-defense. This is pretty clear. If the guy is unable to hit a man-sized target at approximately this far away, so, call it 3 feet, when he's had something like half a minute to aim, and pulls the trigger at his own discretion, this guy's not actually a threat. What Han Solo should have done is taken the blaster away from him and then, I don't know, gone and found the guy's parents and given him back because he's clearly from some species where he's like 2 months old, or returned him to the care ward that he escaped from because this guy is clearly incompetent at being out and about in the world. But there's the thing, like, if the guy can't hit you from this far away when he's had a long time to aim and you're completely stationary, he's not a threat. Lethal force is now not justified. You don't need to shoot him at this point. He can't hurt you. He's too incompetent to hurt you. So that change was really, really bizarre because he took a morally defensible scene and turned it to a morally indefensible scene. But anyway, you can still get the originals. It's the one great thing about money grabs is that at the very least he violated his own artistic integrity and is willing to show you the original one for money. So it is, you can still get the originals. So the new ones don't hurt you. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate some people won't appreciate all that Star Wars was, but you know what? Lots of people don't appreciate all that Star Wars is. Lots of people were never going to appreciate all that Star Wars was. As time moves on, it'll become less culturally significant because very, 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 very few movies ever stay culturally significant. It's actually, it's its own topic, which I won't get into, but just a hint at what the topic is. A lot of movies that were like really, really significant, like if you talk to movie buffs and read about movies and so on, part of why they were significant was actually because it was so darn recent. I mean, movies as they, if you read, say, in the 1990s, movies that are recognizably in the form they are today began really in the 1930s. We watch virtually nothing from the 1920s. Granted, there's silent films and stuff people have some historical interest in, but movies as we recognize them, you're talking the 1930s. So the 1930s to the 1990s is only 60 years. In the 1990s, there'd still have been people alive who remembered the originals. This is very different than something like Pride and Prejudice, which is still very widely read, despite the fact that everybody who knew anybody who read it is long dead. So, all the stuff that like was really, really important to us most of that is going to go the way that it has throughout all of time. That all sorts of things would happen to people in villages that none of us presently alive have ever heard of, where it was very, very significant to them, and a few generations later, nobody knew that it ever happened. Maybe it's written down, and then a few hundred years later, nobody knew that it ever happened. Same thing's going to happen with movies. I mean, you have to accept on some level that very, very little makes it more than a few generations out. Very, very, very little compared to what happens. So, hence the wonderful, wonderful scene in A Man for All Seasons when Richard Rich, when Thomas More offers Richard Rich a post as a teacher, and Richard Rich said, "A teacher, but if I was," he said, "Be a teacher, you might be a good one, possibly even a great one," and Richard Rich replies, "But if I was, who would know it?" And Sir Thomas More at the time, replied, "You, your students, God. Not a bad audience, lad." It's a great, great line, and delivered much better than I did just now. But the way I delivered it is not going to give me any copyright strikes. Anyway, I could probably make a decent case for fair use, but in any event, this is very safe. Look up the original, by the way. You can find it. It's a great scene. Watch the whole movie. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. Really, really very well done. Anyhow, even the popular culture that was important to us most of it fades. And you have to, you know, you have to make peace with that one way or another, that most of what's important to us is going to be important to us and not to that many other people. It's one reason why there was the idea of the classics, where everybody would learn things. You know, the best stuff of the last 2,000 years, well, go back 100 years, of the last 1,900 years, although it included out to Plato and Aristotle, so, you know, the last 2,400 years, that people have been studying for a long time, that when they're the occasional thing that is so good it's worth studying for millennia, that the thing about those is that this way we all actually do have something in common with other people. In the modern world, we've largely severed that. But again, that's something of a digression. The point here being that Star Wars, as such, it happened. You can watch it. I can show it to my children. I don't have to show them the sequels. I don't have to show them the prequels. And despite the fact that the prequels, in theory, change things, or maybe they went differently, and then the originals change them if you view them in chronological order. I don't even know how you want to resolve that if you want to try. I don't know that anyone cares enough to try. Haven't heard of anybody actually devoted to the prequels, and especially not anyone more devoted to the prequels than to the original trilogy. They do completely different things that utterly change the characters in the sequels. Well, all right, that's what they do in that city. I'm in this city. They don't do that in this city, and by this city I mean my house, the people I choose to spend time with, which make up, you know, my family, the people I choose to spend time with. That makes up almost the entirety of my world. So there are other people who tell different stories somewhere else. Okay. And so it really reduces your stress level quite a lot if you realize there's no such thing as canon. Because I've run into people saying, like it or not, these are canon now. Well, what that actually means is, like it or not, the people making the movies I'm not going to see are going to some degree, respect the things they said in these movies. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to watch those movies either, so it's not like I'm going to watch, you know, episode 9. There's, you know, if I'm not going to watch episodes 7 and 8, I'm certainly not going to watch episode 9. So, so what? I mean, really, so what? They're people making stuff I'm not going to see, or going to be partially basing that off of other stuff I didn't see. It's just nothing to get upset with there. You know, it's a pity. I'll certainly say a prayer for them, but that's kind of as far as it goes, really. And that's about, I think, the right way to deal with it. It's easy to get stressed over things, and there's plenty of stress available in life. So if you look at it the right way, where there's no such thing as canon and all works of fiction are entirely optional, it's a lot less stressful. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.